Hey everyone, get ready for an inspiring episode of Noon featuring Kevin, a firefighter paramedic with 14 years of experience. Kevin's journey is diverse and inspiring, from working in Yellowstone Park and teaching to authoring books like Wild Rescues. He brings a wealth of knowledge and passion to his work. Join us as Kevin shares insights from his career and experiences from the National Park Service to his current position in the fire department. This episode promises to be a captivating exploration of bravery and community service. Let's get started. Ever wondered about the incredible world of nursing? If your answer is a resounding yes, then the Conversing Nurse podcast with the wonderful Michelle Harris is a must listen. Join Michelle each week as she engages in heartfelt conversations with nurses from diverse specialties, sharing profound insights into their roles, their love for nursing, and the positive changes they bring to the profession. Tune in on all major platforms to experience the warmth and inspiration of nurses who truly make the profession great. Link in the description below. All right, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us on the Noon podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. And I'm, thrilled and honored to be on the podcast.
Yeah, no, awesome. I really appreciate you coming out. Can I go ahead and get an introduction?
Sure. My name's Kevin Grange. I'm currently working as a firefighter paramedic with Jackson Hole Fire EMS. And prior to that, I worked for the National Park Service as a firefighter, paramedic, and park ranger. And then along with that, I'm also an author. And so I've written 2 books about EMS. Lights and Sirens details my experience in paramedic school in Los Angeles. And then Wild Rescues talks about my experience working for the National Park Service and practicing wilderness medicine.
You're a busy guy.
I am. I guess if I have one talent, it's time management. So I'm able to kind of squeeze it all in and then still have some time for, hanging out with my wife and our dog and, being outside and doing some skiing and mountain biking and that type of thing.
Yeah, that's fantastic and crazy. You've done so much I don't want to assume your age, but you look fairly young. So it seems like you've done quite a lot in your short amount of time here. Have you always wanted to write?
I have, I guess, I was first someone who loved reading. And so they say all writers started as, readers. And so I read a lot growing up. And then I just naturally started to write stories, and through school I was assigned to keep a journal. So it kind of became a way for me to process my experience, but also celebrate my experience. And so my books, specifically my EMS books, I like to say I'm in the book, but I'm not the hero of the book. So a lot of the books is me learning from my mentors and my role models and me kind of making the mistakes and then learning. And then I guess as I learn, the reader learns. So, but yeah, I really enjoy writing and mainly just celebrating the great people I work with alongside and then, the beautiful areas that I'm able to work in.
Yeah, it sounds like a really unique perspective, and I look forward to reading those books. What year or when did you start EMS?
I've been doing it for about 14 years now, and I'm actually a lot older than I might seem. I'm 49, so EMS was sort of like a second act for me. And I guess initially, my first EMS job, if you will, was working as a lifeguard in high school, and then I sort of left it and pursued writing, and then around probably in my early 30s, I was drawn back in. I met someone who was taking an EMT class, and then, it kind of rekindled this interest I had in high school. And I took the EMT class and I loved it. And I loved the community and the people I was working with. And then I was inspired to go to paramedic school and then just kind of start over, in my 30s. And I was kind of like the underdog, my paramedic school. I was really the old guy, I was 35, I think it was. And there's 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, and I hadn't been in school in years. So it was definitely challenging and took a lot of hard work. but I love it. I like working as part of a team and helping people. And as you know, from being a flight paramedic, every day is different. So the long answer to your question is 14 years as an EMT and a paramedic, but then, I was a lifeguard in high school.
No, that's fantastic. Do you regret at all waiting to come in till such a late time?
Um, I do, wish I maybe had kept with it. And I think, there wasn't, no one in my family was a firefighter or a paramedic or, really a doctor. So it wasn't necessarily a field I initially was drawn to, but I do sort of wish that maybe I'd started working in EMS younger and maybe gone to med school, probably similar to you, started in EMS on the ambulance, then get my flight paramedic, and then maybe go to med school. Um, but on the other hand, I think when you come to it in your 30s or 40s, like I did, you have all that life experience. So I feel like I can connect to my patients in a way that maybe some of those younger folks can't just because they haven't had that life experience. So I do think I have some of that wisdom that comes with age and ability to connect with all my patients.
So, did you have any problems in your EMT class or in your paramedic class with such an age difference?
I think some of it was just getting back into taking class. Like I know cardiology didn't come easy to me, and I had to spend a lot of extra hours learning the rhythms and even just the med math. I have taken a few of these firefighter exams, and I hadn't seen, decimals and percentages in years. So I like failed those first few, and then once I just studied the basics, then I was able to pass. So I think they had a leg up on me since they were recently in school and, just kind of had that mindset and those study habits. But, through hard work, I was able to keep up and graduate. So that was nice.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And it sounds like, from the outside, I feel like you might have had a little bit of a harder time just because it is just a bunch of young bucks, right, coming in, and there's a lot of testosterone and muscle being thrown around for people coming in at that young age. We talk a lot about the paramedic God complex. Do you feel that that's something that you dealt with at all while you were in paramedic school or even right after paramedic school?
Um, how would you describe that? Like I think I've heard varying interpretations. So,
Yeah, so just really cocky, nothing that you can do will be wrong. Every decision you make's right.
right. Yeah, no, actually, I have seen that in some younger providers. And I was talking to a friend of mine, John Politis, who's been in EMS since like the 70s. And what I said was, these people that had that, they hadn't been humbled by the profession. And by that, I mean, when you have that kind of cocky arrogance, at some point, it's going to come up to kind of like bite you in the ass and you're going to miss something. You're going to tunnel vision on, or you're not going to do a full assessment. So those people, the profession hasn't humbled them. They haven't had that experience of missing that diagnosis, or maybe they do that patient refusal and it ends up being really bad. So eventually, the professional generally tends to humble people and they realize the responsibility and the training. And another thing that I learned early was in my EMT class, the day we graduated, he's just like, the most you're going to know today. And the minute you walk out that door, you start forgetting the material. So that kind of instilled in me just this habit of just studying up. Like we have to continually study because we're always in the process of forgetting or losing the material. So that was great advice that kind of keeps me on my game.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic advice and one that I wish I had learned at a younger age, right? Because now I feel like I'm playing catch up with the critical care stuff.
Sure.
It is a lot. It is a lot of information we have to know and a lot of information that we have to keep up with and practice, and it's constantly changing. But, I think it's good when you're able to take that advice and keep with it. That's fantastic. So, you actually held a unique position in the National Park Services. Is that correct?
Yeah, I didn't really know there were EMTs and paramedics working in the national parks. And then one day I was at Yosemite and I saw an ambulance drive by and the light kind of went off. And so I pursued that and was eventually hired to work at Yellowstone and Old Faithful. So uh, I was specifically on the ambulance as a paramedic, and then I did get my firefighter training through the Park Service. And then the side of the ambulance said Park Ranger. So I kind of wore a bunch of different hats.
That's really cool. Did they require that you get your Fire 1 and Fire 2?
They didn't. That was something I kind of leaned into because I wanted the training. Um, I was specifically hired just to be the paramedic, but I wanted to kind of be available to help in any capacity. So I did do the National Park Service Firefighter 1 and Firefighter 2 training.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and people don't expect to see firefighters, so like we'd have these fire alarms at the Old Faithful Inn, and we'd roll up in our fire engine, and they just couldn't grasp it. All of a sudden, this fire engine appears in the middle of a national park, and people are always taking pictures and everything. So it's kind of funny.
I guess it's something you really don't think about, right? Until you need it and then it's there, which is fantastic. What did you do that was different? Did you just transport from the park to the hospital, or would you do, like set up an IFT for somebody to meet you on the border of the park?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it kind of depended on the call, but a lot of like books and TV shows and movies, they all show that urban EMS. And
Mm-hmm.
so, it's all about that high call volume. So what I learned by working in like rural EMS is the call volume's lower, but the calls take multiple hours. So, at Old Faithful, I could run 3 calls in a day, but each call took 3 hours from, dispatch until I got back home. So sometimes, I guess a lot of times we would drive the patients out on the ambulance and rendezvous with another fire department, on the side of the road at a rest stop. And then they'd take the patient the additional hour to the hospital. Because from Old Faithful, I think the closest hospital was an hour and a half, and the closest trauma center was 3 hours.
Wow.
Yeah,
So did you guys fly a lot of people out?
not a ton, but we definitely flew the critical ones, assuming the weather cooperated. And, um, you know, it's crazy in national parks. Like one time we were trying to land a helicopter and there was a huge bison on the landing pad,
Oh my
you know,
gosh.
just things you don't think about. But yeah, we did do a significant amount of like life flights for sure.
Yeah.
You know, the critical, cardiac patients or critical trauma patients. And sometimes we land at the Old Faithful Clinic. There was like a small clinic with like a PA and a couple of nurses there. And then other times we just land, do a scene call where they're landing either in a pullout or on the road or in a field, wherever.
So what does a critical trauma patient look like in the National Park Service? Is that typically going to be a fall or?
Well, that's a great question. It's kind of dependent on what park you're at. Like Yellowstone, you have a lot of the thermal features, so the hot springs. So, people are wandering off trail, trying to get that close picture. And so you do have some of those thermal burns. But, you know, in Yellowstone too, it's like people want to approach the bison or the fluffy cows, as we call them.
The fluffy
And
cows.
so there was like 5 bison gorings my last summer
Oh my
there.
gosh. 5?
Yeah. But your typical call is probably like motor vehicle accidents or, fall. Like I also worked in Yosemite in California and you had a bunch of rock climbers there. So you get some pretty bad traumas, based on people falling or that type of thing. Um, and then the last thing was there's all the seasonal employees, the people who work in the concessions. And so they're just there to party and make money and they live in like a dorm. So there you would see kind of like your city calls, a lot of, you know, ETOH patients and some overdoses, and you get some like domestic violence type thing. So that was a whole like almost like urban element I hadn't really expected to see in a national park, but you know, that exists as well.
That's so funny. And the people that were doing that, were they mostly younger people or was it a good mix of ages?
Mainly young, probably 18, just kind of first job, leaving the house. So they're probably doing what we all did at that age.
Yeah.
And then you get all ages, but yeah, it was definitely a diverse population for sure.
Yeah, well, that's good. It's needed, right? We need those people to go in and work the parks so that
Yeah,
everybody can enjoy the park.
definitely.
So now you are in a fire department. Is that correct?
Yep, it is. Um, so yeah, I think where I'm at currently is I'm currently a firefighter paramedic, and I guess one thing I'm grappling with is, do I want to stay with the fire department and promote? And so with the fire department, you can kind of promote out of doing what you love to do, which for
Mm-hmm.
me is patient care and contacts. So I'm trying to decide, do I want to stay with the fire department, or do I maybe want to, because you're promoting into administration, or
Yeah.
do I maybe want to jump over like yourself and do flight or get my nursing degree? So that's kind of where I'm at in my career. But I do like the hands-on with patients, and I do like teaching as well. So we'll see where it all ends up.
Do you have the option to promote into an education position where you could teach within the fire department?
Yeah, we're sort of a smaller department. We have, I think, 21 full-timers and then some volunteers. So we are creating that position now. There's like a training captain. So that is one position I definitely have my eye on.
That's fantastic. Well, I hope if that's something that you're looking for, I hope that you're able to get into that.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. So, in all of the dynamic positions that you've been in, what would you say is your favorite?
Well, I really enjoy my current job, because I'm with the fire department and I really love the fire department and the people I work with, but we're in sort of that wildland urban interface. So we're on the edge of Grand Teton National Park. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. We get some of those wilderness type of calls, but then we're also in the town of Jackson where, have millions of people coming through each summer. So you do have sort of like an urban element. Um, so it's my current position I love. And then my summer at Old Faithful in Yellowstone, actually, I spent 2 summers there, was one of my favorites just because we all the park rangers lived and worked together. So there was just that great community and, like campfires and potlucks every night. And so, like, the community, which we don't always have in our normal day to day lives, um, we really had that in the summer at Old Faithful. So that was like just really special, just kind of that great campfire community. Yeah, the crazy calls in a national park. I mean, it was just, I had moved there from Los Angeles, and my thought was, because at night, no one was really on call, but anyone could take the call. So I just left my pager on, and I'm just like, I'm going to embrace this experience and go on every crazy call that I can, and just try to grow as a provider. So it was definitely some fun summers for me.
That is really cool. What would you say was your craziest call?
Um, I think my craziest call, there was a number of them, but I guess it was a call for a woman. It came as a diabetic complaint, and then she was at the Old Faithful Inn. And this was a good lesson that, like, the chief complaint that the 911 caller calls in with doesn't mean that's the chief complaint.
Yeah.
I drove there by myself in the ambulance because that's kind of how I rolled sometimes. And then I walk in and she's just in the bathroom and there's blood everywhere on the
Oh my
floor
God.
from having like a GI bleed. Oh, and then I found out she had Hep C and I think some other things going on. So I tried, radioed to get the cavalry coming to help me. But then she was also overdosing on narcotics. And she did have, I think her blood sugar was high, but it was like she had three things going on, this GI bleed, the diabetic thing, the overdose. And then we got her to the Old Faithful landing zone, landed the helicopter, it lifted, and then it had to go back down because of weather. So we moved her to the ambulance. And that was just sort of a typical national park call where there's a lot of reversals and you have a plan, but then the weather changes your plan. It's just you know how it goes being a flight paramedic.
Yeah, no, that does sound crazy. It sounds like she just partied too hard, huh?
Probably. Yeah. So that was definitely an interesting one. And then the wildlife calls are always interesting just because, people don't really expect to like have a bison goring or a bear mauling when they're in a national park, but it definitely happens. And
And are there any signs around the park that say don't touch the animals, don't feed the animals, don't do
oh, yeah,
Oh
everywhere.
yeah. I'm
Yeah, there's
sure
handouts and signs, and now we even have signage in the bathrooms. But
in the
people want to just,
bathrooms.
yeah, people want to get that photo, the selfie with the bison, and never ends well.
That's fantastic. So if somebody wanted to get into the national park gig, what would you recommend that they do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Basically, I recommend maybe, if they have some EMT training or somewhere, maybe they've trained in like a city, maybe get your like wilderness first aid or your wilderness first responder, just to kind of get you thinking of working in an outdoor area, in sort of like a austere medicine type of setting. And then I'd reach out to like your local national park and see if you can do a ride along with the paramedics if they have them or the park rangers. And then most of the jobs are listed on usajobs.gov. So that's where you can look for the seasonal positions as an EMT or a paramedic. A lot of the bigger parks like Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Mount Rainier, Yellowstone, they have seasonal EMS folks. And then it's kind of growing that now they're starting to have more full time, single function paramedics at places like Yosemite and Grand Canyon and everything.
That's so cool. Grand Canyon definitely needs it, right? Because the amount of death we see out of Grand Canyon is kind of insane from people going in underprepared. I feel like though that could be at any national park.
Yeah, but I think Grand Canyon and Yellowstone are the two have the two highest call volume. And I haven't actually been to Grand Canyon, but people start hiking down. I think it's the Bright Angel Trail, and it's maybe 80 at the trailhead, but then as you drop down, it's 120 degrees
Ugh.
down at the bottom, and then they hike down, so they don't realize you got to hike back up, which is the hard part.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I have a really random question. Sorry. So, when a person is gored by a bison, right? Does that bison then get put down, or is it just kind of shoo out of here, move on with your day?
yeah, great question. The bison definitely does not get put down.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Yeah, the thinking is if the animal is just behaving naturally and it's maybe the human's fault, they don't put the bison down. And even with grizzly bears, so when I was there, a guy got mauled to death by a mama grizzly with two cubs. And so that was like a surprise encounter. And, they wouldn't have put the bear down had it just disappeared and done its thing. But it actually like had cached the body under like vegetation and was using it as a food source. So that's like atypical behavior for a bear. So they did put that one down. Um,
I think that could be argued, but I guess I don't understand how bears work. I mean, if I found food, I would store it too, right? Like to come
right.
back to it. So that's interesting. That's really interesting.
Yeah. So in that case, they put the bear down, but we have a bear here, Bear 399, who's famous, known for kind of raising her litters by the road. And she kind of swiped or, took a bite out of a guy with a similar surprise encounter. But then she fled. And so they didn't put her down just because it was like a defensive attack.
Mm-hmm.
But typically bears don't think of humans as food. So in that case in Yellowstone, where it saved cached the body and was going back, they're like, yeah, we kind of, and it was right on a really busy hiking trail. So
That's so crazy. That's so crazy. So, as a like we had talked about it earlier, the park ranger kind of is an umbrella, covers a lot of titles. Are you also responsible for learning about the animals and like maybe tagging or doing any other work with the animals?
We're not, although our protocols in Yellowstone, we have all these biologists in the park working with wolves and bison and grizzly bears. So we had some protocols for, wildlife immobilization emergencies. So if, say, they're trying to tranquilize or put down a grizzly bear and they shoot their friend or something by accident. So we had some of those protocols. So we're not actively working with the wildlife, but the way I worked was, you know, they give you the ambulance for the day and you're basically free to do what you want. So I would just drive around to different geyser basins and I'd, walk around, talk to folks, kind of being an ambassador for the park. Because to me, that's a lot more fun walking around Old Faithful than just sitting in the office waiting for a call.
Yeah, no,
Um,
definitely.
so I did some of that interpretation and answered questions, but I didn't directly work with the animals.
No, that's I would hope that you weren't directly in contact with that. I'm sure there are measures though to protect you and the other people who don't directly work with the animals. But you'd also talked a little bit about thermal burns. And as somebody who watches a lot of true crime stuff, we see a lot of like the murders and stuff from people being either pushed into or accidentally falling into some of those hot springs. What is the temperature of some of those?
A lot of them are, over 200 degrees and just,
Wow.
yeah, boiling. And Yellowstone's actually it's a super volcano. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of heat in the whole park is basically a big caldera. And hopefully it won't blow anytime soon because we'd
Hopefully.
all, yeah. But yeah, so the water's hot. And, there's been cases where this one visitor, their dog jumped in the hot spring and they jumped in the hot spring after the dog. And, you know, um, and then some of the hot springs are warm. So you're not supposed to swim in any of them. But late night, some of the concession employees will try to find the warm hot spring, but get in the wrong one and, get a severe burn. So I
Yeah.
had to sort of, you know, each park you kind of emphasize certain emergencies you'll respond to. And Yellowstone definitely had to, I think I got my advanced burn life support just to kind of study up on some of the latest science and fluid resuscitation and that type of thing.
I
Um,
didn't even know. So I'm assuming that's a B as in boy LS. I didn't know that that was a certification. That's really cool.
yeah, and I guess the main thing these days is they're kind of trying to simplify the Parkland formula. So an adult, I think it's just give them 500 mLs over the first hour, a pediatric 250 mLs. So we're not having to do this crazy math because I guess the burn shock is not kicking in as fast as they thought. So on the EMS side of things, you know, 500 mLs over that first hour, just kind of simplify it. And that frees us up to do some other things like maybe control their pain and, that type of thing.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And really, really decreases the amount of work, just like you said, because that Parkland burn formula can be intimidating for somebody who is actively trying to treat somebody with a high body percentage burn area, right? So you're trying to calculate math all while you're trying to get an IV access or any type of line to help this patient with pain medication. And now you're trying to do math. Yeah. That's really cool that they do that. I'm going to have to look into that certification.
Yeah. And then with the parks and even here in Jackson Hole, uh, we're we're very like resource limited. So a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times in Yellowstone, I was in the back of the ambulance by myself, and even here, sometimes you only have one other person. So you really gotta work efficiently and decide what you need to do right now and what can wait till later. And so that whole way of like triaging care was a big like learning area for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially when you're by yourself. So in the department that you're in, it's not a two-tier. You guys are your own transport service. Is that correct?
We are, yep, which is nice, and it's what I love to do. And I love fire too. We just, you know, don't really have many fires. So it's
Sure.
great that I love EMS as well. But yeah, we do our own transports, but we do work a lot with private flight companies. Air Idaho's big here. They're owned by Air Methods, and I think Classic is also in the area.
Hmm.
So lots of flights coming out of here.
That's fantastic. Do you guys staff enough people for an engine and a rescue, or just a rescue?
It's sort of evolving, but anyway, each day we could have anywhere from say 3 to 5 people
Wow.
at the station. And if it's a fire call, we all hop in the engine. If it's a severe medical call, we might take three um, or four in the ambulance. Or sometimes, if we have enough staff, we might take the engine and the ambulance to a call if it's in town. But again, some even now working with Jackson Hole Fire, sometimes the calls are an hour away to get there. So
Yeah, so how do you handle when you have like a severe car accident, right? Are you taking both the engine and the rescue? I'm assuming that you have all of your like extrication gear and stuff on the engine.
yeah, that type of call, we would ideally take both. And then we do have a lot of great volunteers, so they could come in and help get that engine. Maybe there's only 3 paid staff, so maybe we start with the ambulance and then they follow up with the engine, a few minutes later. So it's a
Sure.
big like chess game, but it works pretty well.
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to not work in a system that is single tier. I've always worked in at least a two-tier system, which is now that I think about it and then I talk to more people who deal with systems like yours, that's quite intimidating, right? Because even out here on a 911 call, if it was a cardiac arrest or some other like severe medical or even severe trauma, I know that if I got that first, I'm going to have at least a rescue with 2 people. And then I have access to an engine with another 3 to 4 people to help move that call along.
Yeah, no, that's one of the great parts of working where you are. And it's a luxury that a lot of like remote and rural and wilderness EMS systems don't have.
Yeah.
So the urban is hard for a different reason. I think just like the hugely high call volume. But
Mm-hmm.
out here it's hard just because it's the long transport times, the limited resources. But as a provider, it's fun because you really get to practice medicine. You
Yeah.
get to go down the whole protocol because you have such a long transport time. And our scope of practice is really wide just because there's not really hospitals nearby. So it's a fun place to work for sure.
Are you guys able to RSI out there?
The Park Service can, in Jackson Hole Fire we can't. And you know we might be going in that direction. I think some of it is maybe our first pass success isn't as high as we want. And I
That's
think some of that
everywhere.
is we don't have a ton of cardiac arrests, so we're not having the practice. But we can go into the OR, at least quarterly, which is awesome just to get that.
That is awesome.
Yeah. Um, so I don't know. You probably know this, that it's like there are a lot of agencies aren't having that first pass success, and then the
Yeah.
IGL seems to be working well. So who knows where it'll all end? But yeah, that cuff tube and the trachea is still the gold standard. So that's kind of what we shoot for.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And that's absolutely insane that the park services allow you guys to RSI. Like, what a cool thing. That
Right.
scope of practice, I would love to just look at that scope of practice. If they're allowing RSI, what other kind of stuff they're allowing. That's really cool.
Yeah. I mean, I can try to send you the protocols. Like we have surgical crike here in Jackson Hole, and
Mm-hmm.
um, our medical director, Dr. Will Smith, and AJ Wheeler. Will Smith was in the Army, so we get a lot of stuff from military medicine. So like we were using ketamine, you know, before a lot of other departments, and TXA, and now we have Disuvia, which is like it's like an oral fentanyl. It's just a tablet. So if you have that patient who's outside and they're cold and the intranasal is just going to drip out, you can give them this Disuvia tablet, which is 30 micrograms, um, for pain relief. So, it's a progressive agency, which is cool.
That is really cool. I've never heard of that medication. So that's really cool that they give you an option to utilize something that's PO or ODT versus, like you were saying, intranasal. It is just going to drip right out if somebody's really cold. So, what would you say is one of the biggest challenges right now in your field or in your position?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, my own specific position is where do I want to take this second act of medicine? Do I want to stay with the fire department or maybe bump over to the clinical space? And then I think here in Wyoming and a lot of like rural areas, it's just we're losing people left and right, that we can't keep folks in EMS or even in fire a lot of times just because of the burnout. So I think that's like the biggest challenge. And even here in Jackson Hole, where I think our community is about 10,000 people. So it's hard finding, paramedics. And so I think overall, that's the challenge that we all face, just staying in the profession, staying healthy, staying resilient, staying engaged. So,
And I know you talked about burnout being one of the reasons, but is there, without giving me numbers, or is there a pay issue there, or is it a not enough people getting into the career because it's hard? Or what do you think that deficiency is in your area?
I think probably pay because, Jackson Hole, it's one of the priciest zip codes out there. It's like a Beverly Hills, but then we're also like rural Wyoming.
Mhm.
So I think for a lot of years we were paid like a rural fire department, but we're living in sort of like a Beverly Hills. So that's like slowly catching up. So definitely some of it's the pay, and we all have second jobs. A lot of folks work in construction, and I teach a bunch, ACLS and PALS and do some writing. So I think pay, and then I think over the career field, I think COVID just burned out a lot of agencies and, you know, in the cities specifically. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, it's a tough job for sure.
It is a tough job, and it's hard to get people to realize how much of a rewarding job it is, like for yourself, right? So I think a lot of people that think about getting into these positions just don't think it's worth it anymore.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it's up to all of us to kind of like do podcasts like this. So thank you, just to kind of talk about the rewarding parts, whether it's the teamwork and the camaraderie or, saving a life, the feeling of like, say you and I were partners of you got that critical call, you're bouncing ideas off each other and it is super rewarding. You're providing great care. It's fun. It's dynamic. Yeah, that's like a great thrill. And then, when you have those positive outcomes, yeah, it's definitely a rewarding career.
I agree. And, like I said earlier, almost 20 years now, I do think that the companies need to step up, though, and whether it's going through government or however they need to figure out to pay their employees better wages, right? There's no reason, this is my personal opinion, there's no reason that if you have a full time job, no matter what you're doing, that you should have a second job to supplement income just to live.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, especially if you're in a service job like this. I think if you're working 36 to 48 hours a week, whatever the service is requiring of you, I don't think that there's just really no reason that you need a second job to supplement your income. Unless you're going out and doing crazy things, right? Like if you want to go on vacations every other week or 3 or 4 times a year or whatever, then cool. But just to live, we shouldn't be required to have a second income.
Yeah, I love that. Because then it puts more stress on us and we're already working in a stressful field and less time to catch up and be healthy and see our family. So yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, we're literally forcing our young paramedics, our young nurses, our young healthcare professionals to take overtime to get all of this extra income. It's insane to me. We talk about it a lot on here. I think it's just nuts.
Right.
So I think I know the answer, but do you prefer urban or remote EMS?
Well, initially, coming out of paramedic school, I was all wanting to get back in the urban space, but now having worked out here, I definitely love the remote EMS and the remote medicine, and um, just because a lot of the challenges, and like I said, you really get to practice medicine. So, and then another thing which is nice is like when you live in a beautiful area like a national park or here, um, you can run a tough call, but you're in this beautiful surrounding. So like the surroundings kind of help you heal, if you will.
Yeah, no,
You
that
know?
totally makes sense. That's what I was
Yeah.
going to ask. Is it a nice little balance where, you're in a tough, like maybe really crappy situation, but it's hard to be upset about it because you are out in the middle of a forest or you're in this beautiful meadow or wherever you happen to be. And that kind of helps release all of the anger and the sadness that you've built up.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at Yellowstone, I remember just some all night calls, and then you're driving back into the park, and it's like 6 a.m. and the sun's rising, and you see the geysers going off. So, experiences like that kind of help, re inspire you and whatnot. And then I guess conversely, because I like to just be honest on things, but when I was in Yosemite Valley, you're in a valley and you're surrounded by like these tall granite mountains, and it's winter. Um, a place like that can be hard in the winter because it's dark and the sun almost doesn't really come through the valley except for a couple hours.
Mm-hmm.
So in those kind of situations, it can be isolating to some degree because there's not a lot of people. So then if you have a tough call, there's no distractions and it can be dark and cold and isolated. So, there are the wilderness, it's a two-sided coin. It can inspire you, but in certain cases it can also like make your post-traumatic stress a lot worse.
That totally makes sense. So is PTSD something that you suffer with?
Well, I like to think of that as it's like it's on a continuum, kind of like altitude sickness. So with altitude sickness you have acute mountain sickness, and then it can progress to high altitude cerebral edema, haze, or high altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE. And so I think I definitely have operational stress and post traumatic stress. And I think having been in the field for 14 years, I'm able to kind of catch it early in the continuum, so it doesn't get to that really like red lined negative thing. And so I guess the answer is kind of like yes and no, but I think I can catch it early now, and I have sort of like a checklist. And this is one thing I mentioned in a lot of my presentations is we have these checklists now for like intubation or a chest tube, which I can't do in Jackson Hole, but I kind of recommend people have their own checklists, and it's like you write out things that help you recover after a tough call. So maybe it's listen to music or see family and friends or go on a hike or whatever it is. And then so you make your own checklist to help you get back to being ready to go and resilient. And so if you have that tough call, you follow the checklist almost like a protocol. And some calls, maybe only you need one or two things on the checklist. But then maybe the tough call or a string of tough calls, maybe you got to do each thing on the checklist, and maybe one of them speaking with the counselor or therapist. So I've got my own personal checklist, and that kind of helps me heal a lot faster. And
That's a
then
really cool, like really good method of taking care of that. And you're the first person I've heard say that. That's a really cool just idea. Is that something that you learned and taught yourself, or is that something that you learned from a professional?
a little bit of both. I guess the one cool thing here, because the Park Service has, you know, had the mental health challenges that other EMS agencies have. And so here in the Tetons with Jackson Hole Fire and Grand Teton National Park, we have this thing called the Teton Interagency Peer Support Team. And so it's representatives from all these different agencies. And so we come together, and like I'm one of the people on the team. So if you're with like Grand Teton, you have a tough call, you can reach out to me, and then so you can talk about it with the fellow responders. So I guess we've like normalized the discussions on post-traumatic stress and how to heal, and then we got some donations, so you can actually get free counseling and therapy if you need. So the cool thing here is we've normalized the conversations, and then um, Laura McGladley, she's done some really good work. I think it's called a responderalliance.com. And she has this like stress continuum from like green to yellow to orange to red. So one thing we do on shift is we check in, at the beginning of a 48 shift, and it's like, where are you today? It's like, oh, I'm in the green, I'm ready, I'm feeling good, or maybe I'm in the orange, and from one reason or another, or I'm in the red, like maybe someone just passed away. So we've normalized that discussion and kind of that check-in. And then we also ask like, which direction are you looking? So it's like if I'm in the orange, kind of midway in that stress continuum, but I'm facing red is a lot different than, hey, I'm in the orange, but I'm facing green. I got a vacation coming up. So that's a really cool thing we've done out here is like we've normalized the discussions, and we have a treatment plan in place if people need help.
Oh, that sounds very progressive, which is really cool. My concern would be that people weren't being honest, right? Because that's just another task that they have to do when they go in for shift that day.
Sure.
How do you go about normalizing that conversation?
Well, a few of our captains, they'll check in, and I think with us, just being, if we're honest with about our own struggles, and other people will be honest about theirs. So I think that's how we do it. And um, so yeah, people may not be forthright, but they know that they may not want help, but they always know help's available. And then another cool thing is um, maybe maybe someone has some kids and they just need a night out with their wife and a babysitter. The tips program could give them money for the babysitter too. So it's not all, it's like whatever you need to do to heal. It's not just talking to a counselor. We can help you do that. So I like that it's kind of comprehensive. There's, like one provider, he ran a infant cardiac arrest and, choking, and the child didn't survive. And after that call, he just wanted to get like a massage and then the tips program, so, paid for the massage because that was how he healed. Whereas someone else might need so it's kind of cool how it adapts to the person.
Yeah, no, that's a really cool, it sounds like a really cool program. You're saying the TIPS program. Is that something that is offered through the fire department specifically, or is that something that you guys put together on the side?
It's, I guess it was put together through a few different agencies, like Teton County Search and Rescue and Jacksonville Fire and Grand Teton. So they representatives from each agency came together and had the idea and then put it in place. And I guess I can email you the website, and maybe put it in the show notes, and then I can also email you some of that stuff on the stress continuum if you'd like.
Sure.
But yeah, it kind of just happened with a bunch of folks from certain agencies coming together, and it's spreading into other communities where there is that multi-agency response, and it's having like a lot of success, which is nice.
Well, I think, and it sounds fantastic. I think that's something that could be easily done in any community, right? Getting together to kind of promote that kind of a thing. I could see how it would work better in a remote location like yours, because like you were saying, you only have 10,000 people, and it would be a little harder, I think, in somewhere where like there's a million people, so you have
Sure.
30 to 50 ambulances on shift during a 24-hour period, not including your fire services. But I'm sure if we tried, we could get something up together similar to that. I think
Yeah.
it's possible. I think that's a really, really neat and really cool idea.
Yeah, definitely. but like you say, there are additional challenges with bigger agencies. So
So you said that you trained in Los Angeles. Did you like living in Southern California?
I did, yeah. I mean, it's beautiful down there, and I think it was a great spot, for a few years. But ultimately, like long term, I'm more of a mountain guy, or maybe a little less crowded area.
Oh yeah, it's definitely crowded.
No, it was a great place to learn, and you know, I might have ended up there, but to be honest, like I graduated paramedic school and I just, I wasn't getting hired by the fire departments there. At the time they'd have like 3,000 applicants, or LAFD, I think had 10,000. And, you know, and this is what I tell people too, like maybe your ideal job, maybe it's not the one you get right out of the gate, but maybe it's your second fire department. So my plan was to go somewhere else, out of state, work for a couple of years as a firefighter paramedic, and then move back to California. But then once I got out here, I'm like, oh, I'm loving these smaller mountain towns. So then I stayed.
Yeah, I just fell in love with it. That's fantastic.
Yeah,
That is awesome. So do you feel comfortable sharing one of your worst calls or maybe your worst call?
sure. Well, I know you mentioned the podcast kind of deals with some of the mental health stuff. And I think my worst call was actually a number of calls. And so I think one was a murder suicide situation. And then I think that one was hard because it was a crime scene. So the police only wanted me to go in and, determine death. And so I think that one was hard in that, it wasn't me and my crew, which takes some of the pressure off. It was just me by myself. So that was, obviously the call itself is traumatizing, but then just having to go in by myself. But then later that week, I think we had another suicide. And then I was off duty and I came across a guy who'd been hit by a car, which was a traumatic arrest. And so I mentioned those because I think there's a tough call, but then when the tough call starts stacking up and you haven't had time to process the first one, that's when you're really in danger of, some of the PTSD kind of sneaking up on you. So that week in particular was definitely hard because they just kept happening so fast. And I think this is where the city folks have a really hard time because they do have that huge high call volume where
Mm-hmm.
you can't catch up and process what you've even seen because some of my friends and maybe yourself, they'll run like 27 calls in 24 hours. um, so that it's happening so fast you can't even process the last traumatic call and you're already on the next one. So that was definitely probably like my hardest week. And then like I said, I just went to that checklist and tried to. I knew I was sort of like hurting, so I just was like going easy on myself. And one thing when I am in that space, I don't drink a lot of alcohol anyways, but I'll just like not drink any, and I'll try to focus on like positive choices, um, and kind of go through that checklist of exercise. Reach out to family and friends, maybe go, so just kind of take it step by step.
It sounds like you have a really high emotional intelligence. So you're able to recognize where you're at and what you need to do to get out of those ruts. Do you mind if I ask what's on your personal checklist when you know things are getting a little hard?
Sure. Yeah, I think that like reaching out to family and friends, and that doesn't necessarily mean talking about the call at all. And actually, most times I don't, but maybe it's just, you know, hanging with my parents or going on a hike with my wife. So that's one. And then journaling, being a writer, journaling helps sort of process the call. And then I think exercise definitely helps me. So maybe I'll go to like maybe a hot yoga class, just kind of sweating it out. Or I used to surf in California, so that was kind of good, just so exercise is one, journaling, family and friends, getting outside, and then yeah, I have used the tips program and spoken with counselors, and that's definitely been helpful.
Oh, that's fantastic. Do
Yeah,
you think that those calls, I mean, you've been doing this for 14 years. You've seen a lot of death now, right? We all, at the 14-year mark, we've all seen quite a bit of death. Why do you think that those calls specifically bothered you? I mean, it sounds like it was a really rough week.
right.
That sounds hard, but do you think it was the idea that you couldn't do anything to help? Or do you think it was like did you relate to it in any way? Why did it bother you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think haven't really thought about it, but I think how the calls stacked up on one another, and then just to me, just the violence of the murder suicide was hard, and then the suicide calls I always find hard just because it's, someone's really suffering before they make that choice. So I find those calls very hard. But I know when I look on other calls, and actually the Responder Alliance, they talk about this too, that like certain calls where maybe family members are present, that can increase some of the stress on the responder. Because like if we just find a deceased body, we don't have we don't know them, and you know, but then when like I had two New Year's Eves in successive years, we had a cardiac arrest at midnight on New Year's Eve. One was like the matriarch, the grandmother, the
Yeah.
whole family was there. So things like that, when you see the family suffering, can make the call worse. So I know that's one thing. And then obviously calls with children can be like extra hard.
Yeah, no,
So
definitely. Do you think that there's something that our companies could do to make us better providers, right? Is there something that we could go through to help train to be better in those situations where we do have family members, right? I feel like, and this is just my personal experience, like, and this tells you how long I've been in EMS, right? But when we were coding people, we asked the family to step out, and they're actually saying now that you really want not a huge party, but you want one or two family members to be present with you in the area so that they can witness you trying your very best, trying to do everything you can to bring this person back. And that way there's no question, when you're leaving at the end of the day. But I feel like we don't get any training as to how to, I don't know, come up to that situation, right? What do we tell the family? How do we do that? We always, I mean, in my experience, it was called the chaplain, whether it's police chaplain or fire chaplain. But I think we should be getting that training.
yeah, I agree. And as you were talking, I wrote down this little note that says just like role confusion, because I think that can, so say you're running the call, and then but you're also being asked to talk to the family. Your roles are kind of conflicting because you're trying to do one thing, but then you're being asked to provide this emotional support at the same time. So I know on a few calls I've had where I've had that role confusion, they've been harder to recover from. And they're trying to advocate for now having like a family liaison, so maybe you and me are running the call, but then another provider is they're just with the family, talking to them, explaining, like what the Lucas device is. Because a lot of family members, that thing's kind of violent, but so
Yeah.
explaining things like that, explaining what we're doing. Um, so yeah, I think companies and agencies can kind of step up and giving us that support, whether it's the extra personnel or even just little things that build morale, like the search and rescue team here. They're great at just like building morale with these little things. Um, Even just having like awesome snacks in the fridge, great drinks, like whatever it is, Gatorade or I don't know, coffee drinks, and just taking care of your people. I think a lot of like private EMS and public agencies, it doesn't have to be these huge things, but these small things can really help morale, and that helps us perform at our best and stay in the profession. And I guess the last thing I would say is the cost of just that employees always leaving is probably a high cost. Whereas if we just like invested in you and created that great work environment, you'd probably save money in the long run, I would think.
Right. Stop with the pizza parties, right? Like,
Right.
we're worth a little more than a pizza party.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think boosting morale in any department is a really great step in the right direction. It's hard, though, right? It's hard when we have people who are so angry after COVID, right?
Right.
Where the ones who are still here, still working, are just angry because we're short staffed all the time. A lot of the
Right.
time we're underpaid. We don't have, even during COVID, not a lot of us had all of the equipment that was necessary to be working in these environments. Not everybody, but some people didn't have those necessary standards that we should have. And I think that, I mean, we talked about it a little earlier, it just burns out. We burned out a whole lot of staff members, and now we're trying to catch up. And it's hard for me to say that we will catch up from this.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a big challenge, but I think, yeah, hopefully spreading awareness. And then I guess in my books, like Lights and Sirens and even the Wild Rescues, I often say people know what we do, but they don't know how. So I'm trying to like spread the word of how we save lives, but also like the cost of working in this profession. So hopefully we raise that awareness and then the standards increase, and we just got to keep making our voice heard. So
Would you recommend people coming into this job?
I would, but if someone was to ask me about the job, I would just be honest about the challenges. But I think it's an amazing job, and if I was to start all over, I'd still start in EMS because that foundation, no matter where you go in medicine, you're just like a rock star as far as assessment and handing like if I was to go in cardiac arrest right now, I would rather a paramedic or even a well trained EMT to be the first responders over any doctor except maybe an ED doctor. Just because, we should have pride in that we're the professionals.
You don't want that podiatrist showing up.
Right.
Not to say anything bad about a podiatrist, but they're always the first ones on car accidents. It's really amazing.
Yeah. Because we have that here, just, limited resources. But I've learned that no matter who's in the healthcare industry, the one who's all amped up is the one you shouldn't listen to. Because, like,
Yeah.
if yourself shows up or that emergency department doctor, or that nurse, if they're really the ones to listen to, they're going to be calm. They're going to, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're going to, so it's knowing who to listen to on those scenes or any scene is actually like a good talent to learn.
So if you had a kid, right, and they're 18 years old and they're like, Dad, I really want to become an EMT or a firefighter, do you feel like you would fully support that?
Yeah, I definitely would. In fact, my nephew is interested in being a firefighter, so he's doing the like I forget what it's I think it's like the reserve program with Huntington Beach. So he's in high school, but they meet twice a month and they got bunker gear and they do drills. So I definitely support it. And I see it as it's kind of like we're a sports team, but we save lives. So
Yeah.
I love that camaraderie, and it's a good balance of hands-on skills, but also like critical thinking.
Do you
Um,
find yourself giving him advice, like mental health advice specifically?
I haven't really given him that advice yet. Um, but if he's not out running calls. But once he is and starts seeing that stuff, I would definitely, in a nice way, just let him know, like, hey, like, do you ever have any questions? Or I think it's good to alert people to the potential dangers.
Yeah, no, definitely. We just had another firefighter suicide here in New Mexico, unfortunately, and it's coming to younger and younger firefighters, right? And then usually we see it after retirement, but it's really sad that we're
Oh, yeah.
seeing these guys in like the middle of their years in EMS and doing this kind of stuff. And I wish we had a better way to help these guys where it wasn't reactive, right? Why are we reacting to these suicides? Why aren't we being proactive? Why aren't we doing more to prevent this?
Right.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
rough.
I agree. And it seems like we're trying to get the words slowly getting out, but I think there needs to be action behind the words, like we're talking about, you know.
100%. 100%. So, what would you say has been one of your favorite calls? Or what's your like when someone asks you what's your favorite call, what's the first one that pops up to mind? Like what's one story you share over and over?
I guess the recent call that comes to mind is this. We had a 7-year-old girl who was out here sledding with her family, and she hit a tree, was unconscious briefly, I think threw up once, and then they called us. And this is one of my favorite calls just because it has a good outcome, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also why I like EMS. So we arrived on scene, and we were packaging her. We were using like a vacuum mattress, which we tend to use here over the backboard, just, if we can. Um, and then we just started transporting, and we were noticing that she was kind of getting increasingly, I guess, agitated. But with pediatrics, the agitation's not going to manifest like an adult. So it was more just kind of like acting out.
Mm-hmm.
And so my partner and I, kind of keyed in on that. And we started, like, I really love when it's just you and your partner and you're just bouncing ideas off. And um, eventually, like, she became less responsive. And then her eyes just were looking in the corner of her sockets and just almost like she was probably seizing.
Mm-hmm.
So we recognized that she was having this, traumatic brain injury. And we, you know, started going lights and sirens and called ahead, and they got a helicopter. So eventually she had skull fracture and I think 2 brain bleeds.
Oh wow.
They flew her to our closest trauma center, which is 5 hours away on by ground in Salt Lake. Um, but she ended up having a great outcome and full neurologic recovery. So I think that was a story that I like because the family actually reached out to me, and every year on the anniversary of her accident, they like send us a thank you letter. But
Oh.
yeah, so that was my favorite call just because it was a good outcome, but also just that, head injuries are always evolving. They're either getting
Mm-hmm.
better or worse. And so I think my partner and I really nailed it just because we kind of keyed in on those subtle, like pediatric findings initially. And then, took the right steps to ramp up the call and, call it a level 1 or trauma red, as we call it. And it was also nice that the interagency with the flight teams, the weather lined up. So everything kind of lined up perfectly, which it doesn't always do that. And then with a great outcome.
Yeah, I love when that happens. The great teamwork is just one of those, it makes you feel really good,
Yeah,
always does.
definitely.
Oh, it's nice when you just kind of mesh really well together.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, I want to give you the opportunity to, if you want to do any shout outs or if you want to talk about any resources that you feel that we didn't talk about, or if you want to talk about anything that you feel that we should have talked about, to go ahead.
Sure. Well, I'll email you those links I was talking about the
Perfect.
peer support team. And one thing I want to just present, which I've learned working in wilderness medicine, which I think is really interesting, is this idea of rescue collapse. And so, a patient is out in the elements. Maybe it's a search and rescue patient, or um, so when the EMS, this has happened to me a few times in my career, but when the EMS folks get there, the patient surprisingly gets worse. Like I learned this in Yosemite. This guy was out for a hike, did some magic mushrooms with his friends, wandered off. He was missing for 2 days, and it was like 40 degrees and rainy. So when we found him, he was standing. He was kind of with it, but then we got him in the ambulance. We started warming him up, and his mental status just decreased. He became like a GCS of 3. And so I don't I don't think a lot of people are aware of this idea of rescue collapse, and it's kind of this nebulous thing, and doctors aren't sure if it's because it's an irritable heart, irritable myocardium, or fluid shifts, or some of that maybe that acidic blood, if it's, like the afterdrop and hypothermia kind of coming back to the core. Maybe it's all of those things, but I also think it's like the mental aspect that like people are holding on. They're kind of in charge of their own care because they're by themselves. And so that sympathetic nervous system's engaged and the blood pressure's staying there. And then the first responders get there and then they just give up. And so they bottom out. The blood pressure drops. So that was a really interesting thing that I wanted to share, that surprisingly, I think it could easily happen in a city too, like the moment we arrive can be paradoxically the most dangerous part of the call because the patient can give up mentally and then you have these internal things going on. So from that, I learned that, in these patients, when I show up, I might say like, we're here, the worst is over, but you can't give up now. Like you got to stay involved in your own care. Hopefully that kind of keeps them, still fighting to some degree. So I don't know, that idea of rescue collapse, and actually like with avalanche patients and some of these search and rescue, they're suggesting now you handle them really gently because that heart is irritable, and get them horizontal, warm them up, but just maybe even slowing down a little bit instead of like yanking them out of the, Yeah. So that was just something really interesting I wanted to throw out there that people might not have thought about, and it's kind of one of my lessons learned from working out here.
Yeah, no, that's great. And you're really pointing out something that can be pertinent to a lot of people, right? Like I do think we see that a lot, probably a lot more, like you were saying, it's pertinent to the city level too, or like people when they get to the ER, right? Or like maybe they're dumping their pressure because now they've made it to the ER. I can let go, I can relax a little bit. So no, that totally makes sense. And I appreciate you pointing that out. That I feel like that's important and it's good for people to think about, and not something that's pointed out very often. So that's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me, and I've had a great time. And yeah, I'll give you my email as well. If any listeners have questions, I'm always available to help answer them and kind of help people explore wilderness medicine or whatever questions they have.
Awesome. Shout it out.
It's pretty easy. Kevin.grange@gmail.com.
And that's GRANGE, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Awesome. And then where can we find your books, Kevin?
Luckily they're on Amazon, and some bookstores have them, but if they don't, they can easily order them. And then they're also audiobooks, which I love when people send me photos of them like posting up in the ambulance and they have the audiobook going. Because I worked for an IFT for a few years in Los Angeles, and I know how it goes. You're posting up.
Yeah.
So that to me was like awesome. That's like my roots, and to hear him listening to my book or see him is really cool. So yeah, there's audiobooks or ebooks, or you can get the paperback.
That's fantastic. Well, I appreciate you joining us on the 911 Nonsense podcast today, Kevin. It's been a great conversation, and I appreciate you answering all my dumb questions.
No, I loved them, and yeah, it was a lot of fun. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. I hope you have a good day.
All right, you too. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Kevin. Bye.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Before we wrap up, we have a few important announcements to share with you. Firstly, we're excited to announce the launch of our brand new 911 Nonsense Facebook group page. It's a community where everyone can go to connect, share ideas, discuss topics from the show, and get all of the most recent updates about the podcast. We'd love to have you join us and be part of the conversation. Next, we want to ask you to rate and review our podcast on your preferred platform. Your feedback means the world to us and helps us reach a wider audience. By rating and reviewing the show, you'll be supporting us in a big way and helping others discover 911 Nonsense. If you enjoy what we do and would like to support the podcast even further, we have a few options available. You can visit samspursuit.com to find the links to our 911 Nonsense merch page and our recently released Noon gear page. Every contribution, no matter the size, goes a long way in helping us continue to better the podcast. We know that not everyone is comfortable being on the podcast, but we still want to hear your stories and experiences. If you have a compelling story and would like to share it to be read by me in a future episode, please reach out to us via email at 911nonsense@gmail.com or through our website's contact section. If you choose to be anonymous, we'll make sure to respect your privacy while sharing your story in a way that resonates with our audience. Thank you again for tuning in. We truly appreciate your support and look forward to bringing you more engaging content in the future. See you next week.